So welcome and good evening. Thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Tara Smith. I'm the Executive Director of Central Hall Commons, a multi-generational community center here in Piscataquis County. Central Hall Commons' mission is to nurture a welcoming, inclusive, healthy, rural community culture by engaging people and organizations in the Maine Highlands region in connecting, celebrating, and learning together. We envision a community where all voices are heard and people of all generations feel safe, valued, included, and cared about. I am honored and inspired to introduce tonight's common conversation, an introduction to the Our Common Purpose report, and our speaker, Carolyn Lukensmeyer, to guide us in this active implementation of our mission, vision, and values. The Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship spent 2 years engaging with communities all over the US to explore how best to respond to the weaknesses and vulnerabilities in our political and civic life. Dover Foxcroft was lucky enough to be one of those communities. Thank you to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and Darshan Gu for moderating that listening session and keeping us connected to this work. The final and bipartisan report, Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century, was released in June of 2020 and includes 6 strategies and 31 ambitious recommendations to help the nation emerge as a more resilient democracy by 2026. This first session tonight, led by Commission member Carolyn Lukensmeyer, will be an introduction to the report. Following monthly discussions will be held on the first Thursday of every month and will focus on each individual strategy identified in the report. Carolyn J Lukensmeyer is the Executive Director Emerita of the National Institute for Civil Discourse, an organization that works to reduce political dysfunction and incivility in our political system. She previously served as founder and president of America Speaks, an award-winning nonprofit organization that promoted nonpartisan initiatives to engage citizens and leaders through the development of innovative public policy tools and strategies. America Speaks also worked with the European Union and in more than 20 other countries around the globe. During her tenure, America Speaks engaged more than 200,000 people and hosted events across all 50 states and throughout the world. She formerly served as consultant to the White House, Chief of Staff from 1993 to 94, and on the National Performance Review, where she steered internal management and oversaw government-wide reforms. She was the Chief of Staff to Ohio Governor Richard F. Celeste from 1986 to 91, becoming the first woman to serve in this capacity. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Carolyn. I pass it on to you now to lead us through this introduction to Our Common Purpose.
Well, Tara, it is indeed a pleasure and an honor for me to be with you. In addition to all those professional things that Tara told you about me, I'd like to share with you that Maine has a very special place in my life and my heart. I, for 35 years, have had a small cabin in the woods on the Damariscotta River. So there is no question but what Maine is a heart and soul place for me. Our long run goal is to get as many citizens in the United States of America into active work with us in their own communities to implement this set of strategies. I have never seen democracy under such a threat as it is right now. And I think Darshan, who's been a stellar staff director for Our Common Purpose, also knows that our report arrived on the scene at an even more timely moment than when the commission started. So the importance of the implementation work has taken on a life of its own. Darshan, I think it would be great if you would take a minute, and folks, Darshan did the impossible in terms of staffing a commission of 31 people with only one half-time person and an intern helping her. And she's now taking on the lead on implementation. But fortunately, we have added a few more resources. But Darshan, please.
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see you tonight. And thank you for joining. And I see some familiar faces from when we visited you in Dover Foxcroft. So I want to thank you for those of you who have returned. We were so lucky in doing the work of the commission to be able to hold almost 50 listening sessions around the United States and talk to folks about how they were feeling about what was happening with our democracy. And this was back in the winter and spring of 2019. So we have really only felt even more since then the urgency of this work. Dover Foxcroft was one of the very first places we went. And if you read through the report, I hope you will recognize that you all inspired us. Your neighbors who participated in that conversation inspired us. And the commission really took to heart something I was so proud as a staff member to see just how deeply this bipartisan group of academics and practitioners and business leaders and other thought leaders really committed to understanding the stories and the voices that we were hearing through the listening sessions, and to putting out a report that was responsive to those concerns and those hopes and those ideas. So I hope that you see that reflected in the report and perhaps recognize your own voice in there as well. So again, thank you all for your interest and support of this work. And we at the Academy are just feel really grateful to have the opportunity to not just have worked with this tremendous commission to put out this report, but also to now have the opportunity to think through how we can implement the recommendations in the report over the next 2 years. So thank you all for joining tonight. It's nice to see you all.
Thank you, Darshan. And Tara, given how I've started this, you may want to add a personal note in terms of why this is so important to you to launch this series of community conversations.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Yeah, there's so many levels of inspiration for me. I was lucky enough to be part of those initial listening sessions and just really, really enjoy and appreciate the work that Mark Hughes has done in Maine and shared here locally. So I feel like as a community member and as somebody who is representing a community center and has the opportunity to put this work out and be an organization that is known for creating a space where civil discourse can occur and exists in a safe and healthy and productive way. I just feel that it's really important to continue to make that happen. It seems that somehow the distance between each other has given people permission to be even less kind and less understanding and less reflective. And that saddens me, as somebody like Joseph said, who came to this area with hope for community and appreciation for kind of those multi-generational values that can exist in small communities. I'm hopeful and inspired by the work that we can share that here locally. And as a leader, I'm currently struggling, on a daily basis with people coming to me now, with issues around masking and vaccinating, and how do we gather again? How do we talk to each other again? How do we maintain and embody the values as an organization that we've strived for and created of inclusivity? How do we welcome everybody and consider their circumstances? So I'm really grateful that you all are here tonight to lead us in being better people and sharing that in our community.
Thank you, Tara. And all across the country, we are hearing the stories about how, given what happened with the pandemic being politicized, that often now in communities, the place that this disrespect of each other and anger and defensiveness shows up most quickly is about masking and is about vaccinating. So I think not tonight, but I think, Tara, we could talk about specifically how we take some of the principles and tools of civil discourse and apply them to that very immediate need that's more pronounced right now in small rural geographies in the country than it is in large urban centers. So I put a marker on that as a possibility for a session. Well, my job with you tonight, which I'm thrilled to be doing, is to give you an overview of the entire report. And then after the fact, some additional community conversations will occur, taking a deeper dive into certain topics. I want to say just Tara said some things, Darshan said some things. I want to add 3 or 4 more sentences about how the commission worked, because I think it exemplifies what we're trying to accomplish and frankly demonstrates that it's possible to be done. There were 31 members of the commission. We came from very diverse backgrounds, by race, by gender, by the roles we play in the world, by geography. I'm going to pick an example that makes the point. One of our co-chairs, Danielle Allen, is a renowned political philosopher in the United States, pretty much way on the liberal end. She wrote a definitive book about the Declaration of Independence that put a stake in the ground about what the aspirations of our founding fathers really still challenge us about. Another extremely impressive member of our commission, Danielle Allen, runs an ethics center at Harvard, is a gentleman named Yuval, my gosh, why have I lost his last name? Yuval Levin. He sits at the American Enterprise Institute, one of the most conservative think tanks in Washington, D.C. And he is renowned as one of the most highly respected conservative political philosophers in the country. So those 2 ends of the continuum at the academy were fully represented with other folks along the spectrum. And in each area of our work, we replicated that process, where the diversity was in the room around the table. By virtue of the level of care and concern we all had about our democracy, that's what we shared. We shared a set of values on which there weren't differences about both the state the country's in and what needs to be done about it. And by excellently designed working sessions and small groups and task groups and in our plenaries, we actually were able to come to the place that through patience and I just heard a new phrase that people are talking about. One of you mentioned active listening. I've just heard of a whole set of program that's being put into place called generous listening, which I think adds the emotional aspect to the intellectual aspect of active listening. So by virtue of doing that in pairs and small groups and meeting in our home cities, the commissioners came to a place where all 6 strategies, all 31 recommendations were signed off on by all the commissioners. Now, for sure, there are some recommendations that some commissioners are way out there pushing more actively, probably the one about term limits to the Supreme Court. But no commissioner is going to tell you that there isn't reason for that recommendation to be taken seriously, to be debated, and to be looked at. So I think that's important for you to know in your communities as you begin this work. The other piece that I'll mention is that we all also understood this is going to take decades. We didn't get in this situation because of Donald Trump. Donald Trump ended up being a symptom of things that had gone wrong with our electoral system, probably starting as early as the 1980s. Now, Donald Trump did become a cause in making some of this much worse, but the structural issues in our democracy we'd been surrounded with for some number of years previously. So the commission targeted our 250th anniversary of the country's founding as a point to put a stake in the ground, to say it's our job as we move from the heavy work of analysis and strategy and action to implementation to show that we have made progress by 2026. That's why we're so excited to be partnering with Central Hall Commons and with dozens of other organizations across the country, and why we are always looking for more individuals and organizations that want to become champions of specific recommendations. But enough on process. Let me jump directly into the content. And frankly, again, given the size group we're on, I actually can talk a long time about what's in this report. So at any point that I say something that you'd like to ask a question about, just raise your hand and we'll stop and take that and respond to that and then go on. As we did our work, we understood that we thought there was a relationship between three elements in our democracy that have been in a vicious down cycle. And our goal was to come up with recommendations that were interactive between these three aspects of our democracy that could put us back on a virtuous cycle. So we came up with recommendations that are in depth on civil society, and much of what you talked about as your reasons for being here tonight fall in that territory of our work. We also did it about civic culture, which again is very closely aligned with much of what you were talking about. And then we talked about political institutions. Now, you didn't happen tonight to speak about any of those institutions other than to acknowledge that we're all watching on a daily basis, that for several decades, we have had a Congress that is dysfunctional and doesn't deal with the big issues, doesn't deal with climate change, doesn't deal with income and wealth inequality. So those political institutions are part of what fuel our problems trying to work together in communities at a cultural and civil society level. So we intentionally looked to find strategies that covered these three arenas. The first two strategies, and the third one in an interesting, more integrated way, but the first two for sure, are all about our political institutions. The first strategy, which is about achieving equality of voice and representation. Well, you don't need me to say that we just watched on January 6th, the most extraordinary threat to the institution of American democracy that has been seen since the Civil War. And now what we've been watching since then is a direct impact on whose voice counts and who even can vote. So we know this set of recommendations is essential to preserve the institutions in our democracy. So we did some pretty, I could have said this as a process comment. We did some pretty radical recommendations, but none that had not been well researched and that there were not already organizations who had looked at this and believe it should happen. So here's an example. Enlarging the size of the House of Representatives. You know, back when we started, each member of Congress represented, I'm not going to remember off the top of my head, maybe you do, Darshan. We're now sitting in a place where each member of the House of Representatives is dealing with 750,000 people. How real is that for them to stay in touch with that many constituents in any meaningful way? So we looked at this issue. And even though it's radical, and Darshan has been lovely in chat to let me know that when we started, nobody had more than 30,000 people they were represented. So we looked at it and we said, yes, we know this is radical, but how can we put it forward in the most likely way to be achieved? So we chose the number of increasing the House of Representatives at a size that it could still work in the actual House of Representatives. They could still meet face to face by taking the galleries. So some people are interested in going much, much larger. But we tried to do it in a way that would preserve from a conservative point of view. And I have to say, in terms of the architecture of our country, I'd call myself a conservative. So that was a place we made a compromise on that example. Another example, and I'm not going to go through them all, and we hope that all of you will read them, and any of you who would actually like AAAS to send you a hard copy rather than having to do what Gloria did in downloading it. Just put that in the chat room and I'm sure Darshan will make it happen quickly. We also looked at the Supreme Court. We know the whole issue of packing the Supreme Court will just become a political partisan football going back and forth from administration to administration. So we went a slightly different direction. We said, let's give the Supreme Court term limits. Every other elected office or appointed office in this country has them. So we suggested 18 years, which allows for real wisdom and a long history in terms of setting precedent, but also doesn't mean that the same person has that much power for more years than that. And then I think, given what's just happened contemporarily, equally important, we suggested that no president, even if he or she's a two-term president, can appoint more than 2 Supreme Court justices. Now, again, I'm not going to go into every recommendation, but I wanted to give you the example that we pushed the window on the political institutions. We said these things have to change. So the second strategy is all about empowering voters. And that's what we see such a threat today. In fact, I heard on the news before I joined you, there are now 48 states in the union that are considering and moving toward passage laws to restrict access to voting. At this point, it's more than 400 single laws in 48 states. So we wanted, and we saw this happen during a pandemic. I mean, think of it, we had the largest voter turnout, and now both liberal and conservative think tanks both agree there were 18 legitimate examples of fraud in the 2020 election. That's nationwide, all level of government. So we did have the most secure, most inclusive election ever happened in American history during a pandemic. So strategy 2 basically moves to institutionalize that, to have people have more power over where and when they vote, and to deal with moving the election day to Veterans Day. We had a lot of conversation of what was the right day. And again, both conservatives and liberals on the commission felt like honoring veterans who are protecting our basic right to vote, that it made great sense to actually honor them by making that election day and a holiday. So let me stop there without going into any more, but have I given you a sense of the spirit of the recommendations about political institutions?
Carolyn, I have a question actually. When you first started talking about the 3 different trajectories or the 3 different topics, could you describe the difference between the first 2?
Yes, I'd be happy to. And Darshan, if you want to add something, feel free. In terms of civil society, we were actually, one of the things that's very unique about the United States, in terms of, if you think about the sectors that we work in, government, private sector, and then what we call nonprofit. The United States has a more fully funded civic society sector than literally any other country in the world. So it's all those organizations that play a public service role, a nonprofit role, and a non-governmental role. And it's that institutional framework is what we incorporated in civil society. In the civic culture, we were much more focused on what all of you talked about. What's happening in our communities? How do we talk to each other? How do we behave with each other? What's our level of what we all know? And it's one of the things that de Tocqueville also talked about us in 1837, was that they didn't call them nonprofit organizations, but he called them associations, and the level of respect and civility among people were what made this democracy work. So the roots of those 2 elements that we were talking about, essential to a democracy, were recognized as unique in the United States that long ago. And we now recognize And there's a lot of debate on whether it was the disaster in the political institutions that began to degrade the other two legs of the stool. Social media is given a lot of credit for degrading both civil society and culture. But what we came to understand, if we're going to make a leap forward at this point, and these things interact with one another on a positive cycle, all three of them have to have very, very serious work. Does that help? Thank you for the question. And Carol, I think you have a question also.
I did. I have a quick question. The strategy you just mentioned about moving Election Day to Veterans Day and creating a holiday, does that require congressional action?
That is one of those recommendations that could be instituted at different levels of government. So states could institute that. So you could create a state could make that day a holiday. If it was going to be a national holiday, it would have to happen through, my understanding is through congressional action. I don't think the executive branch can do that.
I do know, Carol, that there are, in fact, several of the most active and nonpartisan veterans groups that actually have been talking about this for a while. So this is a great example where the commission joined a very active advocacy element in our culture and actually wanted to piggyback, if I can use that term, or wanted to join work that was already being done. So the third strategy, which is titled Ensure the Responsiveness of Government Institutions, began to focus directly on the issue of the relationship between government and we the people after the election is over. Are we ever invited to the table for policy discussions? Do we ever have an opportunity other than through polling to influence something like climate change? And one of the recommendations that I happen to be the expert on the commission was something called citizen assemblies. And the country of Great Britain, a group of climate change activists, went to the British Parliament and described to them a process called citizen assemblies, where people just like you and I are randomly selected to represent the population. And we go through almost like a jury process on the issue of climate change. And we look at the options. We hear from experts on both sides. But what do we, the public, believe should be done? What's happened in Great Britain is the following. The Parliament agreed that this group called, I'm forgetting the advocacy group's name at the moment, but the bottom line is they held citizen assemblies in 5 regions in Great Britain first. So they recognized the cultural differences by geography, which we, of course, would really have to do in the United States. We're almost like several different countries between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And once the results from the 5 regions were done, that material was put together and a national citizens assembly was convened to look at the same questions, and the British Parliament accepted those recommendations to be part of their deliberations on the floor of the Parliament. And we wrote a recommendation just like that for the US, that it could be called either by the President of the United States or by Congress. It could be on climate change, it could be on racial inequity, it could be in any number of the issues that that Congress has been unable to deal with in a meaningful way in several decades. So we wanted to look at that vital relationship between our voices during the governing process, not just during elections. The 4th, 5th, and 6th strategy, particularly 4 and 6, are more closely aligned with the issues that you brought up as you were introducing yourselves. So I'm going to spend a little more time on those, and hopefully we might even chat about a next direction. So strategy 4 is titled Dramatically Expand the Civic Bridging Capacity. Now those are big academic words, but it means in every community, if we're actually going to break this nut about masking anti and for, or whatever other topic you want to bring up, a community needs a lot of highly skilled process facilitators who are capable. It's what Mark Hughes did that you participated in a couple of years ago, who can create an environment that feels safe enough for the pros and the cons on an issue to be in the same room together. And a key to the design is how you set it up so that first we meet each other as human beings. We don't start I'm for the wall on the southern border and you're against the wall on the southern border. If you start there, it's like Lisbeth said, there's going to be a lot of hard feelings and you might even lose relationships over it. So in the bridging capacity, we understood that we need a national structure to support the human capital and the financial capital to make these kinds of resources available at the community level. It's another reason we're so excited that Tara has reached out to AAAS to continue this work in Dover-Foxcroft. Because let's say we make this happen. Let's say this national trust gets set up. They will actually be a place for funders to pool their dollars to support this human capital and the financial capital, which can then be re-granted to communities that have demonstrated the values and the intentionality of how to do this in their communities. Now, what's especially exciting to us, given the step that Tara and Leslie and the board have taken, Dover-Foxcroft could start a process of doing this on the local level and already being some steps down the road while we're still working on getting the National Trust set up. I hope you're as excited about that as we
I
are.
just wanted to comment that one of the things that is happening, I think, right now is that Central Hall Commons is being identified as an
It's not getting
opponent.
easier.
So you're right, getting a messenger, finding those messengers is really tough.
Yep. And again, I'm happy to connect with you and Tara offline, but even starting out, having some conversations in a coffee shop, not even taking it to your building, which by definition, any physical structure has so much power in people's psyche. So it's like, okay, step back. We may have to go slower on some of this. And then I would also say, not being at all shy about going ahead with some of the programming, knowing that those people aren't going to come, but increasing the numbers of other people that come that aren't that angry or are not that far opposed. Does that make sense? You know, I should add one more thing before I go on. I've been working, I was a little bit early to understanding how much trouble our democracy was in. And I literally have done nothing professionally since 1991, but worked directly on this problem in significant ways. And I feel blessed to do all the things that Tara has said, but I honestly feel like all of that is now culminating in this opportunity to really work on implementing this report. And I would be very remiss if I didn't tell you, I think, that actually my own personal favorite recommendation is 4-1. It is actually creating this national trust to create the human capital and the financial capital that can sustain this work and increase this work across the country for some time to come. So there may be a time when the commission comes back to everyone who's been an ambassador and champion saying, we need you to call your members of Congress to say, it's now time for Congress itself to put some money into this work. When you think of the billions of dollars we spend on so many other things, if you actually look at a federal budget, very little of our tax dollars go into preserving and evolving our democracy. And the creation of this national trust would be a real stake in the ground about committing to the health of our democracy in the future. Now, Darshan, I know I wasn't supposed to lobby like that, but I hope you don't knock me off your list just because I lobbied.
It's okay. It's like having someone choose a favorite child. When someone's brave enough to do it, I support it.
Okay, so thank you. So I'm going to take a dive into strategy 6, which are 5, which so far in this call, we haven't talked about at all. And I have to, now I'm going to speak personally, but I actually feel like potentially the most complex threat to our democracy that is the most difficult to figure out how to fix is where we are on the lack of agreed upon facts when we move into a discussion of a public policy issue. Carol, you spoke about it eloquently out of your own background as a science teacher, but I find this one really frightening in the sense that we have billions of dollars in media business models, both traditional media and social media, that know they make more money by keeping us divided than by being a voice for a healthy democracy. What we've just watched Facebook go through in terms of bumping the decision about Donald Trump's access to his social media account up to an oversight board. And if you read carefully their decision, the oversight board basically bumped it back to management. So even people who are in that world, deeply committed to the continuing evolution of our technology and making billions of dollars off it, really don't see clearly how to deal with this on a mass level. What I love about the commission's work, we dealt with what we felt we could deal with. One of which is convening some of that kind of player to go deeper into this discussion going forward. But another level, and Danielle Allen, I believe, Darshan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Danielle is the person who kind of pushed us in that direction the most quickly, which is to think of, now go back to the local level. We need to be creating what we would call civic media at the local level. We know how many newspapers local communities have lost. We know that there are very important voices out there doing podcasts. There are very important voices out there using the internet to go back to fact-based things. But that might be something very interesting for the Central Hall Commons to do again, an inventory. What are the sources of local information that exist in your county that are fact-based? Are they only issue-based? Are they in general? Are there ways that Central Hall Common could give them a bright light, could shine a light on them, could get, I love the Maine public television host, Susan, what's her name? Susan, help me.
Sharon.
Thank you. You know, if you found something interesting in this inventory, to put that in front of her, she might do a highlighted speech about what you've done in your county, which could then invite other counties in Maine to look at the issue of what fact-based civic media exists in your local community. And then, can the Maine Community Foundation, can the Maine Economic Development Foundation, would they take that on as a project? Think of the kinds of projects they've taken on in the past, the flight of young people from Maine. They're not shy about taking on the toughest problems. And one of the things I love about Maine is we're small enough, people are well enough connected, that if an idea takes hold, it is possible to implement it statewide more quickly than many other states in the country. Okay, so that's the media strategy. The last strategy, and again, this is core what every one of you spoke about. I'm even going to edit the language of the strategy in terms of, for the moment, matching your conversation. Inspire a culture of commitment to one another and to American constitutional democracy. In the report, we wrote it the other way. A commitment to American constitutional democracy, which is the bottom line, and one another. But we can't do either one of those things without doing both of them and have a hope for a healthy democracy. And frankly, each one of you, in terms of what you spoke about, gave examples about the way in which the culture itself of the community in your larger county and in Dover-Foxcroft is something that you have passion, that you want to do something about. You all are already community leaders. So I think that is a place that is very ripe for exploration with Tara and the board and the staff at Central Hall Commons. What's the next step that we could do? You know, I just had a flash. Leslie, how you said that Central Hall Commons has become seen as an opponent. Well, here's a thought. You probably know Craig Freshley's makeshift coffee houses.
We're in touch with him. Yay!
Great.
We're in touch
So-
with him. Yep.
But invite Craig to do one in Dover Foxcroft, not in Central Hall Commons, but in a coffee house, which will be seen as a neutral place, and then get him linked in. You see it's like, figure out how to get it started without taking on the tough opponent issue, and then bring it home as more people get involved.
Yeah, Carolyn, I'm excited to say that I think we're going to be working with Craig as a facilitator for the Working Communities Challenge grant
Excellent.
for the Maine Highlands. So
Wonderful. Give him my warm regards when you talk to him.
And he actually, I invited him tonight. He had another program to run, but wanted to do the same and give you his warm regards and tell you how much he enjoys any programs that you're on. So,
Well, tell him he has to watch the tape since he didn't come.
I will.
So let me stop there. And again, I hope it's come through how heartfelt our intentions at the commission and the commissioners to be in relationship in communities like yours across the country. And I hope I've probably been a little more candid than some commissioners would be. It's easier to do this in Dover Foxcroft in some ways, and it's harder to do it in Dover Foxcroft. That's a paradox. I grew up in a small town in Iowa. I know what it means to live in a small town. I know what it means when rifts happen and what it takes to get past them. And we're now living in a time where our politics is creating those rifts on a regular basis. So we're all in. We want to work with you in any way that makes sense to you. And I'm just going to open it up for questions and comments. I didn't look at my watch. Do we have any time? Even if we don't have time left, we're going to take time to hear from everybody before we
Yes.
stop.
Just feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question or a comment. Carol?
Carol, yes, please.
Well, I want to say thank you to Carolyn because your positive attitude and your commitment is really shining through, because it just has seemed like a daunting task here. And I don't know how it is other places because I live here, but thank you very much for your enthusiasm.
You're very welcome. And I can honestly say that part of that is naturally who I am, but part of that is the opportunity I had at the National Institute to work. In 15 months, we had more than 60,000 Americans in these kinds of conversations. And what I can tell you is that people all over this country, ordinary people like us, they know how wrong we are, where we are is. And most of them, there's extremes on both ends, and I'm sure you've got some of those extremes right in your county. But the vast majority of us, 80% of us, want this to change. We just need help doing it. We need help in terms of the safe spaces, the safe structures, the facilitation. And that's part of what enables me to stay this upbeat about it and this positive. But if I only dealt with how I watch the news every night, I couldn't possibly stay this positive and upbeat.
Chris, did you have a comment?
Yeah, Carolyn, you made the comment that 80% of the people want this divisiveness to end. I think I'm phrasing that reasonably correctly.
Yes, you are.
What do the rest of you guys think about that in our community? Would that be true of us?
That's a great question. Carol wants to respond.
I probably wouldn't agree with it, Chris. But what I see is that so many people are so tired of it that they're just withdrawing. You know, they just don't want to deal with it at all. And so, you know, somebody mentioned that it's always, I think it was Beth, There's always sort of a surface communication, but nothing deeper. And if you try to go deeper, they're going to get angry or they're going to withdraw because they're just fed up with the whole system. And they've been told over and over that you can't trust anybody, the media, the government, the the medical profession. I was a teacher, and let me tell you, teachers don't get any respect at all. So I think that has to be overcome, that tendency to withdraw because it's hard to do.
I have a friend who I go back and forth to church with. And between the two of us, leaving aside a priest or two, we run the church, tiny little parish. And we agree on almost everything. And the things we don't agree upon, we split up and we allow the other one to do his thing. The point is, there's perfect agreement on something that's important to us. And I was riding to church with him the other day, and we got off topic. And he let slip the notion that he's pretty sure the election was stolen. And I was just stunned. Okay. And we both agreed we weren't going to go there because the gulp was too big. And we were happy having something that we could work on together that had nothing to do with that. It's a start. I wonder if there's any projects in this community that could get us working together. I hate to use this word, but I'm looking at people that we see all the time, and it's the same people. And there's an ugly word called the other side, and we're not on the other side, but this is pretty arbitrary. How do we start that communication? I don't even know. I have a lot of conservative friends, but I don't know how to start talking to them about this stuff, much less who I think might lead more of these people into these conversations. That's a real tragedy.
If it's okay for me to jump in, Chris, the issue you brought up is one that we've dealt with in several communities, which is what can be done about what is millions of people in the country across the geography of the US who really do still believe that the election was stolen and who are listening to news sources that reaffirm that on a regular basis. So we've had a little bit of success. I put in the chat room a link to a website that has a documentary, hour-long documentary television program called Divided We Fall. And this is one of the projects I led at the National Institute for Civil Discourse. And we actually filmed two groups of people, Gen X people around metropolitan Boston, 6 of whom were Trump lovers, 6 of whom were Trump haters. And then we repeated it in Chicago with millennials, 6 of whom were Trump lovers, 6 of whom were Trump haters. We brought them together for a full weekend and did what I said to you before, the clue. We started out, they knew that some of them were Trump lovers, some of them were Trump haters, but they didn't know who was who. In fact, later on, they laughed at themselves because who they stereotyped about who they thought turned out not to be true. But we've stayed in touch with these folks since the 2020 election. And one of the things that a couple of them are doing is strong Trump supporters, people who voted for him in 2016, voted for him in 2020, but know that the election was not stolen, who in their social circles are running into people like themselves who voted for him twice, but do believe the election is stolen. And they've agreed to actually run some small groups. So I voted for Trump, but this is the facts I'm using. And to stay with the conversation to discover what finally breaks through in terms of this big lie, which is a real detriment to our democracy. So I'm just telling, number one, you might really enjoy watching the documentary. And then we worked with tons of teachers across the country, and on the same website are the discussion questions that we used for people who watched the documentary. Actually, this one hits me, Tara. You might want to have a movie theater in town show it, and then run discussions in the movie theater after people watch it. That's happened in many communities across the nation. And that's another chance for the Central Hall to do the program, but not be the opponent. But the reason I'm saying this is I think it's a long, slow, difficult process. And I think the only chance of getting someone, or one of the most likely chances of getting someone who's stuck there, is them ending up in pretty intimate conversations with someone they absolutely trust their politics and that they share their politics, and they just keep working it through until something makes a breakthrough.
Thank you, Carolyn. Yeah, I think that would be a great opportunity for our local theater to show that, and for us to potentially facilitate. Thank you for that idea.
You're welcome. Several mayors are doing it in communities that have had a big breakdown on the defund the police issue. It just demonstrates how people who are completely opposed in their politics, when they approach issues in a different way, they actually discover that they have more in common than divides them. Yeah,
Go ahead,
please.
Leslie.
Yeah, one group in our community that occurs to me, I don't know what they feel, and I don't know that it's monolithic, is veterans community. And I wonder, Carolyn, whether you have experience around the country with engaging with communities, engaging with the veterans community in conversation, and whether that's productive.
The answer is yes. Now, Leslie, I'm not going to be able to pull this out tonight, but believe you me, I will find it and send the links to you. There are 3 specific veterans group that recently held a webinar that I watched, that what they're doing on this issue with veterans is unbelievable. And they also would be a great partner to bring a program to your community where you want to focus particularly on veterans. It may take me a couple days to find this.
I can put some of those in the chat too, Carolyn.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm talking? Do you know
Yeah.
what I'm talking about? Okay.
I think I have the same. I think I'm thinking of the same thing. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And
Yeah, that would be wonderful, because it seems to me that is a group that in our community crosses some of the political boundaries. And that might be, like Chris's suggestion of talking about how he and his church friend have things in common and agree not to talk about certain things. I think we might find the same situation might arise, but we might be able to find where the common ground is that we can actually, and the common ground, I think, in that we have and that they have, is wanting democracy to work, is believing in democracy. And so that might be a place that we could start in this community. And there is a significant veterans community.
let me suggest something, if I may. I would be very interested in terms of, as we've shared this time together, if you were going to take one action as a result of the evening that we've spent together, that might again build up this muscle, this civic cultural muscle in favor of democracy in your county and in your town. What's the first action you think of that you might actually take?
Well, an action that I'm taking, along with some of the other people on this call, is to organize a candidate night for our local elections. And I always get a little anxious when arranging a group. Well, one, how many people will show up, if anybody?
Right.
But if they do, how do we keep it civil? there's going to be a question and answer period. Well, the advice I was given from the League of Women Voters was have people write their questions, not say them in person, which goes a little bit against my grain because I want to see that discussion and I want people to have the chance to ask a follow-up question to make sure that they understood the answer, that it was not misunderstood. But anyway, that's the action that we're involved with.
Great. Thank you. We have only a couple minutes left, and this has come to my mind twice, so I'm actually going to say it out loud. We've in this whole conversation, as is absolutely appropriate, been focused on what you're going to do locally. But it also comes to my mind that in terms of the dysfunction currently in Congress, you in Maine have a unique opportunity to be positively supportive of one of the number of things that are happening that are positive but don't get much national attention. And that's the role right now that Susan Collins and the West Virginia former governor, who I'm just having a mind blank, help me somebody what his name is. Darshan, help me, please. Susan Collins, and I can't believe this. Aging does have its impact.
Joe Manchin.
Thank you.
Oh, okay.
This is the most embarrassed I've been in quite a while, I'd like to say. But so Susan Collins and Joe Manchin they met with the president. They had the first conversation about the infrastructure, or first it was about the last COVID bill, and now it's about infrastructure. They've moved their group from what was originally 8 members of Congress, 4 R's and 4 D's, to 20. They're calling themselves the G20. I don't know what the G stands for, but they are actually meeting to try to come up with a piece of legislation that would be a compromise on this big infrastructure bill, where the Biden administration is acknowledging there are some human infrastructures that matter as much as roads. And I don't care how you voted in the election for Susan Collins, for or against, but she and Joe Manchin in that context are in a position to actually potentially make a significant difference in whether or not the infrastructure bill ends up having some Republican support. And it matters. So, sending her field director, sending her a message, just saying you're behind her so that she knows. And I hope you don't feel like I've gone political on you. That is not my point. My point is there are a few things. There's something else called the Problem Solvers Caucus that are working their tails off to find compromise in spite of the leadership. And Maine is a unique situation in terms of Susan's leadership. So I hope you find that helpful.
Thank you.
Well, I hope more politicians get the idea that the voters want them to work together.
That is, Carol, you said it better than I said it. That's what the message is. Thank you for working together. They all need to.
Thank you so much. I think that that's a great place to just pause and share our values. So I'm going to go ahead and do that before we close. I want to thank you, Carolyn and Darshan, for making this possible for us here locally, and everyone that's on the call for joining tonight, and ask you to, to share what's happened here, this conversation, with a friend, and anybody that you can think of that might want to participate and could benefit from it. So have a great evening.
Thank you, Carolyn. It was a privilege being here with you.
And it was a pleasure being with you. And thank you to each and every one of you. It was a great conversation.